Hello and welcome to No Holding Back with me, Susan Estrich. Each week I'll have the privilege of talking with some of the biggest names from the worlds of media, politics, and law. Nothing is off the table. I'll be speaking my mind and encouraging my guests to do so too. Today I'm joined by somebody who I have great respect for and am proud to call a friend. Christie Hefner has been in the business of promoting women and working for women's advancement since I've known her, which is 2 decades at least. She was for 20 years the chairman and CEO of Playboy Enterprises. She promoted more women than anyone I know in a CEO position when she left that job. After 20 years, she was the longest serving woman CEO of a publicly held company in this country. And 40% of her executives were women. And she has dedicated herself to advancing the cause of women in business. And we have worked together over the years with the ACLU and other organizations to try to promote women. And nobody has done a better job of it. She's a friend, a teacher, a mentor, somebody I agree with and support. Christie, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
My pleasure, and thank you for that very gracious introduction.
Christie, are we moving forward? I did the numbers getting ready for you to come on the podcast last night. And I must say, I wrote a book about sex and power 20 years ago, and I think there were 3% women CEOs. And this year, I think we're up to 10% Fortune 500 and 9% in the Fortune 100. It doesn't seem like we're making progress at a breakneck speed. What's your take on it?
Well, we are making progress, but I would agree that it's not at a breakneck speed. We've just broken 30% of women on boards,
Right.
having been sort of mired between 15 and 20 for many decades. And there does seem to be a strong correlation, if not causation, between representation of women on boards and representation of women in the C-suite, which would not be so surprising. So I think when I look back over my career, when you look back over your career, you think about the percentage of women in law schools or in business schools, decades ago versus now, it's more than half. There's definitely progress, but we're not where we need to be. And I think we have to try and be honest and open about why is that. I don't think personally there's a single reason. I think there are some structural problems that we can talk about. I think there are some biases that still have an impact on who gets chosen for big jobs, whether it's C-suite jobs or boards, or frankly, to run for political office.
Yeah.
We're going to all have to continue leaning in.
Leaning in, what are the structural problems you see? I noticed when I looked at VC funding that it was maybe the most stunning number I came up with last night. It was something like 2% in 2022 of all VC funding went to firms founded by women. And that seems to me just frankly terrible. What is going on?
Yeah, it is terrible. And it's particularly unfortunate because there are actually more people employed by women-owned companies than by the Fortune 500. It's a really, really important segment of our economy. That is to say, entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial companies. And if women are not getting fair access to capital, which they are clearly not, then we are losing huge economic growth potential for the economy, as well as, underserving women entrepreneurs and by extension, their employees. There's been a lot written about the whole bro culture of, venture funding. There are definitely funds that are making an effort, both on the VC and on the private equity PE side. But that is a huge problem. I'm most encouraged in that regard by a couple of things. One, that there's been more geographic disbursement of where there is a startup culture. So, for example, in Chicago, where I live, we have a terrific organization called 1871, named after the year of the Chicago fire when the city, in effect, had to rise from the ashes. And it is our tech accelerator. It happens to be run by a woman. And we have the highest percentage of women CEO founders of any city in the country. We're over 30%, still not 50, but a whole lot better than
That's
6
great,
or 7.
Christie. I'm sure you're involved.
I am. And then there's a wonderful nonprofit that I'm involved in called Springboard Enterprises that you know of, that Kay
Yeah.
Koplevitz started years ago, that has been responsible for raising over $20 billion for women tech entrepreneurs. So there are definitely things going on that are helpful, but that is a lag even compared to public company representation that we have to address.
It stuns me because if you look at the numbers, you see that firms run by women tend to be more profitable, more productive. I mean, the numbers are overwhelming that if you put in a woman CEO, you find, or a woman founder, they do incredibly well. So it's not that the women-owned companies aren't doing well. It's that there aren't enough of them and they're not being well funded and well financed. And like you say, they face unconscious biases. I saw one study last night that said when women pitch for VC money or for private equity money, they get asked different questions than the men get asked. Is that your experience?
I think so. And in fact, there was a study just in the last few years, so this is not like 15 years ago, that took pitches and changed nothing but whether the pitch maker was a woman or a man, including what the CV said the person's background was, because that is something that investors judge. Does that person have a track record? And the delta between, commitments to fund between whether it was a man or a woman with the identical business plan, the identical pitch, the identical CV was striking. It was more than 20%. So as has been said, if you have a brain, you have bias. And I actually think one of the positive ripple effects of all of the conversation going on about artificial intelligence is that there's a lot of conversation about bias in AI. And as has been characterized, if you're only entering pale male data, then that's what's going to come out the other end. So if you, for example, are training AI on historically who has been CEOs or historically who have been presidents of the United States, you're going to get a prediction that they look like this, which of course is not predictive of success, to your point, but just predictive of history. And I'm hoping that that conversation in the context of AI, which is itself critically important, also, expands to reminding us of the importance of being aware of how human nature teaches us that we tend to gravitate towards people like ourselves, that we have to work to want to be comfortable in situations of, to quote your podcast, people speak their mind, including differing points of view.
How do you do that, though? I mean, in a practical way, one of the problems is that 15%, numbers I came up with last night, of all VC check writers are women, 15%, 85% are men. So you have a predominantly, overwhelmingly male group judging the women who come in front of them. And if, as you say, if you have a brain, you have bias. How do you break that? How do you get more women in the room writing the checks? I know we're trying to get women on the boards. You and I have been at that for years. In
Right.
California, we've actually got a law that forces companies to put women on boards. I don't know if that's the way to do it, but how do you break down that unconscious bias that leads, for instance, VC firms, I've seen studies, to ask women who come in to pitch, they ask them all about the risks. Men, they ask all about their success projections. And
Well,
that's just different.
yeah, and there's been some interesting studies about how men pitch differently in certain respects. And one of them is they are much more aggressive with their projections, and women are more conservative.
Right.
Candidly, what that really means is women are more realistic and men are less. But the VC world tends to look for the next unicorn. It looks for the hockey stick. It likes somebody who thinks they're going to change the world as opposed to somebody who says they're going to build a hugely successful, sustainable company with really strong growth and profitability. So there's a little bit of that we need to think about. But I like that your focus is on, we need to get women to also be investors. Because the truth is that partly because of the fact that women live longer, more wealth is controlled by women in this country than by men. But women don't actively control their wealth in the same way that men do. They tend to be more passive. They tend to look to financial advisors. They tend to be more conservative in their investments. And it almost reminds me, which you will have a lot of heart for, of the early days when we were starting Emily's List, because we said, right? We said, hey, women candidates are not getting a fair shot because they're being asked different questions. They're being judged as not being meritorious enough in terms of deserving that early money, which is so critical in politics, as you know very well. And the idea of Emily's List was to sort of level the playing field and to vet for electability, certainly female candidates, but to provide those early funds that are so important. And I think that getting more women to think about venture investing, which is happening across the country. There's a Chicago-based firm called Ceres, not like Series A, but like the Goddess, CERES. There's a great East Coast firm called G9 that are specifically encouraging women investors and then investing in women entrepreneurs. And I think I would say to all of your listeners, venture money is risk capital. It should not be the money you otherwise would be putting into your kid's college fund. But many people are at a place in their lives where they can make some investments that are riskier than the stocks and bonds that make up much of their portfolio. And thinking about investing in venture, and particularly firms that will invest at least equally in women entrepreneurs, is a great way of doing good and doing well.
You've been doing a lot of that. I know you invest and you put your money where your mouth is. Tell us about some of the investments you make.
Well, I like working with companies at different stages. Obviously, as you referenced in your introduction, I ran a publicly traded company, and I've been on boards of public companies. I've been on boards of family-owned companies and PE-backed companies, but also venture-backed companies. And it's exciting to work with young entrepreneurs. There's a company I work with now called Public Good that has co-founders, a man and a woman, and they have found a way to use artificial intelligence to look at all kinds of digital content, which they have contracted for access to exclusively with the media companies. And what they're looking for are the best articles in which to embed social impact units that brands sponsor. So you're Mattel, you've got the Barbie movie out, you want people to know that you care about women's empowerment, but you know that if you just take out an ad that says that tends to be disregarded. So instead, you put together with Public Good a quiz about girls' expectations professionally, and you embed it in an article about the number of women who are starting companies. And when you're reading that article, pops up a quiz that says, at what age do girls no longer think they have all the opportunities and options professionally that their brothers have? 8, 12, 13, or 15. I thought it was 12. It's actually 8, which is sort of depressing, but
that's
true.
really stunning, isn't it?
And then the quiz goes on to just give you more information about the challenges and disparities. And at the end, it says, sponsored by Mattel. So that's kind of a cool company
That's very cool. Why is it 8 years old, Christie? What happens when you
that I have not done the deeper dive in terms of the research as to, is that something that's happening in schools? Is that something that's happening that unconsciously parents are, sending signals that are not the signals they want to send? Is it a peer issue? Is it a media influenced issue? Is it all of the above?
Probably
Probably.
all of the above. And how do you change it?
Well,
How do you find the companies? How do you make decisions yourself, just in terms of who you invest in, what you invest? How do you go about doing that?
Well, on the how do I find the companies, I'm very lucky that companies find me. So I get asked a lot to help companies go on a board, be an advisor. Um, so that's kind of, just the advantage of having some profile out there through both nonprofit work I do and all of the myriad of contacts I've made over many years in business. On the criteria, I have 4 criteria for what I choose to say yes to. The first question is, would I want to have a long dinner with the people I'm going to work with? And if the answer is not really, then I'm not interested. It's kind of a luxury that I feel at this point in my career. I can choose with whom I work. And so that's to me very important. The second question is, do I find the business genuinely interesting? And usually that means it's innovative or disruptive in some way. It's not the 5th company doing the same thing. The third is, do I sincerely think I can help them? I laugh about the fact that when I was 29 and Playboy Enterprises was in financial trouble, and I raised my hand to the board and said, you don't need to go out and hire a replacement president COO. I could do the job. I'll form an office of the president with the then chief financial officer, and we can get started tomorrow on the turnaround, which obviously worked out, or we wouldn't be having this conversation.
I
But
was
by
going to say
no,
it worked out well, but where did you
yeah,
get that spunk at
well,
29
that's what I was
with
going to
whom
say.
that you could do it?
By no stretch of the imagination should I have had the confidence to think that I could do that. And I'm not honestly sure exactly where that came from, although I give my mother a lot of credit for a lot of the qualities that I admire in myself, and that would be one. But the point I was going to make is that here I am decades later, unquestionably knowing much more than I knew then. And I actually am much more humble than I was then, a much stronger belief that I'm not always right. There are different points of view on things. And when I'm giving advice to companies or CEOs, I say, I'll tell you what I think, I'll tell you why I think it, but I will always remind you that I could be wrong and you should get other data points. So I always ask myself when a company approaches me, do I sincerely think I can help them? And then the last question I ask myself is, will I learn something new? And I have become a big believer in what I call intellectual agility, in terms of the ability to learn new things and to think differently and to challenge your own thinking. And one of the ways I try and practice that is to put myself in situations with things that are unfamiliar, industries I'm not intimately experienced with, and learn from being in that new situation.
I've met with, gotten to know a lot of male CEOs, and humility and humble are not words I hear very often, are they? Do you?
Um, well, there's a school of thought that's the servant leadership school of thought. That's not a phrase I tend to use, but it's sort of in the same spirit. I don't know. I think the swashbuckling CEO, not to pick on anyone in particular, but he's such a good example of it, the Jack Welch kind of,
Sure.
icon.
Former head of GE,
Yeah, I don't think
really a character.
I don't think that's generally what is lionized anymore. I don't think it's generally what's taught. I think there's a greater awareness of the need to build diverse teams. I mean, we've been talking about representation of women, but what we really want to aspire to is, first of all, a level playing field, but also diversity of thought whenever decisions are being made. And that means diversity of background, not just gender, but, race, national origin, educational background, economic background. There's so much research. You were talking about how well companies do that are run by women. The research is just overwhelming about the better performance of organizations that have, diverse leadership than not.
So why is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, become such a dirty word these days? I mean, you hear there was a time period, it seemed very brief, when everybody changed their websites and said, well, we better, have, it shouldn't look like Mattel in the Barbie movie, it should have some diversity. But it seems like we're now living through a period in which diversity is almost a dirty word. And we haven't gotten diverse yet. I mean, the numbers are pretty overwhelming that Black women aren't represented,
Right.
Hispanic women aren't represented, Black men aren't represented. I mean, it's pretty stunning. The wage gap remains at, I don't know, 13 cents, 12 cents. Women earn on average 17% less than men do. I mean, we haven't achieved equity by any standard, and yet we seem to be in a time when equity and diversity are no longer the stated goals, and they almost invite political trouble.
Yes, that's true. In fact, there's a very good TED talk by Melody Hobson, the CEO of Ariel Capital and the chairman of Starbucks, on this issue of bias and diversity that I encourage. It's like 10 minutes. But what I think has happened is something we can trace also with regard to civil rights. And that is when there's progress, there is often backlash. That just seems to be in the nature of that aspect of society that is opposed to progress and that is quiescent when no progress is being made, but riled up when there is. And that takes various forms. We have a Supreme Court right now that obviously has actually made it illegal for academic institutions of most sorts, although they've just exempted military academies, from taking race into consideration in the application of their
Right.
students. So you have a legal framework that's shifting, and then you have a backlash against the misnomer of things like critical race theory or the movement for transgender rights. And that makes for kind of trickier waters for organizations that are trying to be on the right side of things, but also not stir the pot.
Right.
So what I sincerely think is happening is that the language is changing to navigate that don't stir the pot problem, but the commitment is not. I mean, I'm out there a lot. I actually moderated a panel on hot button political issues in the boardroom with Ken Cheneau, former CEO of American Express and head of the
Sure.
Business Roundtable, and the head of social issues for the Edelman organization. And the reality is that companies can't afford not to be doing that work. It's too important to their employees. It's too important to even investors, even when Larry Fink sort of seems to move back a little bit, it's more about the language, not the actual concern. And I would compare it a little bit to the climate issue, where ESG is maybe not used as much as a phrase, but the work around sustainability is being done to the just as great an extent by companies and by investors evaluating companies.
That's actually very heartening because it is very disturbing to read some of the studies right now. The Wall Street Journal had a story, I think 2 or 3 days ago, about how how men network and men who cultivate high status individuals as part of their network
Mm-hmm.
succeed in doing it. And women who cultivate high net worth and high status contacts are seen as being too ambitious
Are
to
punished for it. Yeah.
and get punished for it.
Yeah.
When I talk to young women and I tell them that their network matters and that who they network with and who they connect with and, how they go about building their
Absolutely.
career, I encourage them to do that. And then to see that it jumps back at them with these old stereotypes that, as you say, if you have a brain, you have a bias. But how dare you still, consider a woman who cultivates high status people to be too ambitious and not, quote, communal enough? I mean,
Well,
that's the
I'll give you
stereotype in the
another,
book.
yeah, I'll give you another example of that's double bind. I often will say to particularly women, but not exclusively, how important it is to develop the ability to negotiate. That you don't get in life what is fair, you get in life what you negotiate for.
Yeah.
And that if you look at the research, women generally are less aggressive in negotiating on their behalfs for raises or promotions. And there's studies that show similarly that if a job is posted, men on average will apply if they've done roughly 20 to 25% of the requirements of the new job. Women are almost the exact inverse, that if they haven't literally done roughly 75% of the new job, they won't apply. So men get promoted on their potential, and women don't get promoted until they've accomplished the things required. And that creates, a divide, which isn't very good.
A huge point to make.
But the negotiating piece of it, which, I try and promote, there was a study recently that said that women, when they do negotiate aggressively on their behalf, are seen as being too aggressive.
Right.
So we have to recognize that solving the bias problem is not just getting women to lean in, it's getting men to lean back. It's getting people to recognize. I use the orchestra example because it's such a great one, that for generations, most major orchestras in the US were almost all male performers. And, orchestra leaders kept being asked by pushy women, why, why are there no women in the orchestra? And the answer was always, oh, we would love to have women. We just can't find qualified women.
We can't find a qualified woman.
They're not as good, blah, 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 blah. And then someone, I wish I knew who, came up with the brilliant idea of having blind auditions. So instead of the musicians coming out on stage and bowing and then performing, they were behind a curtain. So you had no idea what they look like, obviously their gender, or for that matter, their race. And lo and behold, in a shockingly short period of time, like a few years, as we would see today in virtually, Los Angeles or Chicago or New York, the orchestras are full of women because they were always out there. There was just this unconscious bias.
How do you do that in other fields?
Well, that's one of the ways that AI actually... Yeah, that's one of the ways that AI actually could be our friend, in that there's work being done now about, well, what are the like trigger words that cause people to be biased against a female versus a male, or a African American versus a white applicant, that either can be in the job description or in the bio. And how do we extract those, sort of trigger words, so that it's an equal playing field? So I'm kind of hopeful that because of the extraordinary capacity of AI to, evaluate data, we'll be able to start to say, well, what are the things that are causing this? What is the language that's being misused, and how do we adjust for that?
It's a hard one, isn't it?
Yeah, but I like to think, even though all the numbers you quote are of course true, we both have been at this long enough, and I have friends who are older than I am, where, like my friend Jill Wine-Banks, who's an MSNBC legal analyst and was the only female on the Watergate prosecuting team.
Right.
First great woman. Female general counsel for the Secretary of the Army, actually would be a great guest on your podcast, and I'd be happy to recommend her. But my point was going to be, when she went to law school, there were fewer than 10 women in her law school class. And professors would literally say, because it was during the Vietnam War, because you're here, a guy is going to die in Vietnam. I mean, that was in, that was in our lifetime. That was in our lifetime. Yeah. So we can't lose sight of, as Barack Obama would always say, you can do both. You can keep working to make it better while acknowledging that it's better than it was.
It is better than it was. There's no question. When I was in law school, there was Ladies' Day. And there was a particular convention that happened where, I don't know, we had 5% women in my class. And I got called on Ladies' Day to say, Miss Estrich, if you were lucky enough to find a husband to marry who had a lot of money, what state, I'll never forget this, what state would you get married in where you would get the best deal from him? And I answered California, which was wrong. The answer was Texas. And I always thought of that. I never found the right guy with a lot of money. But if I had, I
Nor
would have
did you ever want to live in
adapt.
Texas.
But I wouldn't live in Texas these days because
Exactly.
of all the other reasons. So it's not a good one. It is such a pleasure to have you. And if
Oh.
you could give advice, and I know you do this all the time, to young women who are listening, what would you tell them? Because I sometimes think I come up with all my studies and they're all kind of depressing a little bit. And they suggest, yes, things are better than they were, but they're certainly not where I thought they would be when I started doing this 30 years ago or 40 years ago now. And I started pushing for, I was chair of the Women's Law Association Task Force on Employment Discrimination.
Yeah.
And that was, 40 years ago when law firms were still hiring one woman. And they would say to me things like, well, we've got one woman coming, but if she doesn't come, we'll hire you, as if there was one golden spot,
Yeah.
for a woman. So things have gotten better. But what advice would you give to young women these days when the unconscious biases are still there? Some of the things that we like about ourselves is that we are communal in many respects, and we're not, we're ambitious. You and I have both been called ambitious chicks, that's for sure. And we're confident, but we're not ridiculous about it. And how do you give advice to young women these days who are facing, the men in the pitch room and the men in the CEO suite and the men who are making all the decisions, and they're looking at you differently, and maybe you've got different hopes and needs. Maybe you don't want to lean in at the cost of your whole life. And, I don't want a wife. I want to raise my own kids. So I mean, there are these balances you have to draw. So what advice would you give?
I guess two things come to mind. One, I would say take chances. If you have the opportunity to live somewhere in a different country, if you have an opportunity to be involved in an effort that's outside your comfort zone, if you are thinking about running for office or applying for a promotion that you're not sure you're qualified for, actually do take risks that I think more often than not, we sell ourselves short, and believing in ourselves is the first step to causing other people to believe in you. And then I would echo what you were saying, Susan, about networking. I didn't have a mentor. I know women who have, and I think it's great if you do. But I do think of mentors a little bit like the business version of Prince Charming. Like I have to find the one right person, one right guy. And I don't think that's necessary. So what I say is, build a broad and deep network of people who will be there for you in all the different aspects of your life. And think about that as two ways, not just what they can do to help you, but what you can do to help them.
Isn't that like a woman talking, right?
But
It
that's
does.
the good, those are
That's
the
good
qualities
advice. That's
you don't
wonderful
want to
advice.
lose. Yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
want to lose that. If I say that to somebody, I really do believe what you're saying. I get most of my pleasure these days, or much of my pleasure in business, from helping young women. And
Mhm.
I think there's a special place in hell for women our age who suffer from only woman in the room syndrome.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm sure you've run across them too, who were
Yeah.
women who succeed and say there's nobody else like me, or these young women. I know women who've succeeded in law by making enormous sacrifices, and they think the young women should have to sacrifice just as much. And my attitude has always been we had to sacrifice in some cases too much, and
Right.
young women
And isn't
should
it
have it
wonderful
easier
that
than
we've
us.
come to this place where they don't have to sacrifice as much? Yep.
As much. I mean, I think that's really important. And I think women our age need to be leading the way in helping younger women get to where they want to get without having to sacrifice everything to do it.
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
that's what we try to do. It's been such a pleasure having you, and we'll have to do
My
this
pleasure.
again. And next time, maybe we'll have better numbers.
All right. Thank you, Susan.
Thank
you
you,
for everything
Christie.
you do.
Well, we both try. There's plenty of women like us who are trying. I just started my own law firm 2 years ago,
I
and
know.
it's wonderful to be my own boss. It really is. And it's a little scary. I partnered up with a client, a woman who was a former client of mine, and we're just doing it. And it's, I'd say to anybody our age or younger, keep taking chances and keep taking risks, and just remember to keep helping other people along the way.
Completely agree.